and steadfast, shall we say. Calvin's family was a respectable family of the middle rank. His father worked in a fairly important position for the church on legal and financial matters for various clergy. John Calvin's mother died when he was only 6 years old, leaving him without a mother to care for him, and as a result, he lived for long stretches of time in the homes of other people, oftentimes in aristocratic families of Noyon. His father later remarried, and in the end, John had 3 brothers and 2 half-sisters. John's education was also determined by God. God sent him to Paris, to some of the best schools in Europe, with many of the children of these aristocratic families in 1523 at about the age then of 14. His education, first of all, was rather general. It was intended to prepare him for the work of being a priest. His older brother, Charles, did enter the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church, although he later left it. After 4 or 5 years, John Calvin's father, instructed him to change his vocation to that of a lawyer. This was probably due to the fact that his father was having troubles with the church, was even excommunicated by the church, and he wanted John to be able to support the family as a lawyer. John followed his father's wishes, took up the study of law with enthusiasm and energy, and eventually he would obtain a degree in law. But that was not his first desire. And after his father died, John Calvin returned to his original goal to study theology. He immersed himself in the classic literature of the Greeks and the Romans, as well as the ancient church fathers. He learned Greek to be able to read their literature. He studied Latin, and he became thoroughly acquainted also with Hebrew. That was his foundation for his theological studies. But to this point in his life, John Calvin was completely a Roman Catholic. He obviously had opportunity to hear about Martin Luther and to hear of the things Luther was writing. He could read these things. The Reformation was already 12 years old by the time that Calvin returned to the study of theology. The Reformation was sweeping across Europe. The printing presses were churning out the books of Luther and the works of his opponents. He had many opportunities to read. But Calvin indicated later on that he rejected all these ideas of Luther initially. He was stubbornly devoted to the Roman Catholic Church and her doctrine. His conversion, he indicates, was a sudden thing. He gives evidence that it was a struggle. Not unlike that of Luther, he struggled, though perhaps not as prolonged a struggle as Luther had. But like Luther, he could not find peace with the idea that his salvation depended upon his work, not even a little. God changed the heart and mind of Calvin. After his conversion to the Reformed faith, John Calvin committed himself wholly to the Reformed truth with his customary diligence, and it wasn't long before people were coming to him and asking him about the Reformed doctrines. He had other friends in Paris with the same conviction. This came out publicly in a speech that his friend Nicholas Kopp gave at a school ceremony, a speech that was either partly or wholly written or contributed to by Calvin, a speech that set forth some of the doctrines of justification by faith alone. And that speech required that not only Nicholas Kopp, but anyone connected with him flee, and that leads to a new chapter in John Calvin's life. He became a sort of wanderer. He had to flee Paris in 1533 after that speech of Nicholas Kopp. He lived in various cities in Europe, took refuge under the protection of several influential people, including Margaret of Navarre, the sister of the King of France, who had sympathy for the Reformation. And living in these homes, he not only had protection, but he had great libraries that he could spend time studying in. And he met other reformers that he could count on as friends down the road, as well as men that would sharpen his own thinking on Reformed doctrine. He made his break with Rome officially in 1534 by resigning his benefices. He was receiving money from the church to study for the priesthood. He resigned all of that in 1534. He went to Basel in 1535 and completed the great work of his life, the Institutes of the Christian Religion. The first edition was printed in 1536. When Calvin was yet 26 years old. He passed through Geneva on his way to Basel at another time in 1536, and there William Farel detained him, threatened him with the curse of God if he would go on, if he would refuse to help the work of Reformation in Geneva. And Calvin became convicted that this was God's will, submitted to it, and began to labor in Geneva. So now he becomes a pastor. The work of John Calvin is divided very clearly into three distinct periods as a pastor. His first stay in Geneva was from July 1536 to April 1538. He began to speak as a lecturer, as one training ministers, but he was soon ordained as a pastor and began preaching. But that ended shortly. After only 2 years, he was less than 2 years even, he and Farel and another faithful pastor named Pierre Viret were forced out of Geneva. And that was something that Calvin didn't mind. He wanted to return now to the work of a theologian, a scholar in somebody's library, writing books and being paid for that. The second period as a pastor was in Strasbourg because there was a man there named Martin Bucer who was putting pressure on Calvin to come to Strasbourg and take care of the church, a French refugee church there. So Calvin went there and labored for 3 years, from September of 38 to September of 41. He was a pastor of a French-speaking refugee church in a German-speaking town. It was the happiest time of Calvin's life. It really was. He preached. He taught seminary courses. He wrote commentaries. He did church extension work among the Anabaptists very successfully. He revised his institutes and had them published again. His congregation flourished. They absolutely loved their faithful pastor, John Calvin. He married a widow named Idelette de Boer, and it was a very happy marriage. Professor Gritters pointed out they had a lot of sorrow in their life. They had but one child that was born living and lived only a few days. Their marriage lasted 9 years before